I'm Conor Ruebusch, and if you are interested in the finer points of face punching, you've come to the right place. This is Heavy Hands. Hello and welcome to Heavy Hands. I am Conor Ruebusch. Joining me is Patrick Wyman. We are recording this episode on Tuesday, November 8th at around 4 p.m. And so, though we do not know the result of the U.S. election yet, we will by tomorrow when this episode is released. So allow me to be the first to say that we here at Heavy Hands fully embrace our new overlord. And we are not at all shocked at the beastly form that they took upon entering office, and we will submit ourselves to their monstrous will. Otherwise, we have some fights to talk about. Let's talk about the overlord of the fight game instead of talking about the potential overlord of the crumbling American empire. Let's talk about Conor McGregor and his shot at the second shot, really, at the lightweight title against newly crowned champion Eddie Alvarez. This is the main event of UFC 205. And actually, before we dive in, let me just say that we will be talking about that fight in depth for much of this episode because it's so exciting and there's just so much to say about it, and it should just be an action-packed matchup. And then later we will be talking about Tyron Woodley versus Stephen Thompson for the welterweight title and a welterweight matchup between Kelvin Gastelum and Donald Cerrone. Those are the three fights we're going to be focusing our attention on today. If you want to hear more about the other fights, we talked about Jędrzejczyk versus Kowalkiewicz, personally probably my favorite fight on the card on last week's episode, as well as the lightweight bout between Khabib Nurmagomedov and Michael Johnson. And then we've also touched on Frankie Edgar versus Jeremy Stephens and Chris Weidman versus Yoel Romero on a previous episode. I want to say the episode from 2 or 3 weeks ago when we did a Styles Make Fights preview of those bouts. So we've talked about a lot of fights already. It is a testament to the greatness of this card that we still have 3 fights to which we can devote an entire episode, and about which I, and I'm sure Pat, am very excited to talk about. So let's jump in. The main event, lightweight title fight, featherweight champion Conor McGregor, lightweight champion Eddie Alvarez. The first opportunity to have a 2-division champion in the UFC in, 7 years?
7 years. It was 2009. UFC 94, BJ Penn versus Georges St. Pierre.
Yeah, and Conor McGregor, of course, is hoping to be more successful than BJ was at that event. But either way, like that one, I think any champion versus champion match, when the championships are so highly revered as they are in the UFC, should be this exciting. And Eddie Alvarez hasn't established himself as a champion, nor has Conor McGregor really, but both men have established themselves through the entirety of their careers as incredibly exciting fighters. Excellent opportunists, dangerous finishers, very tough. It's just like it's a battle of wills. I think that makes this one so interesting, and a battle of wills with huge stakes. What's your take on it, Pat?
I am so excited about this fight. I'm excited about it for what it represents in terms of the UFC as a promotion and as a business. Like, I think this is going to be unequivocally the biggest card of all time. It's going to sell the most pay-per-views. It's the most stacked card in the promotion's history. It's a huge moment to go into New York City, into the world's largest media market with this product, especially after WME IMG made the purchase. Like, I think the promos for this card have been outstanding. Like, they used Nas for a promo. I'm like, now we're cooking with gas here, guys.
That is the second time they've used Nas, and I have approved both times. Nas is one of my favorite MCs. So
yeah, I mean, like, it just seems like they're stepping things up, and that this card is a kind of a warning shot across the bows of the sports and entertainment world as to what the UFC can do. Yeah. When everything is humming the way it's supposed to. So I think that's it's kind of a huge moment. And at the top of it, you've got unequivocally the biggest star, the biggest draw in UFC history in Conor McGregor, a guy who is on his way to being bigger than the sport. And if he can do this, there will be no doubt left as to exactly who he is and what he represents as a fighter. So, but like, leaving all of that stuff aside, there's been a lot of talk about all of those aspects of it. Like, this is just a great fucking fight. It's a great matchup, a fantastic matchup between two guys who are at the absolute peaks of their games, who are showing us new things from fight to fight. Like Eddie Alvarez is becoming a better fighter. Conor McGregor is becoming a better fighter. Like we are going to
Yeah.
see two outstanding, like peaking guys in there at the top of this card.
Yeah, it
I mean,
doesn't
it's so awesome.
doesn't surprise me that we can say that about Conor McGregor. I think a lot of us, if not expected, at least knew it was possible that he would change up his game in some dramatic ways after the loss to Nate Diaz. Even though some of us, me in particular, thought he was probably headed down a bit of a dangerous path before then. He's definitely such a phenomenal fighter and such a phenom in terms of natural talent and the way he thinks about the fight game that it's not surprising that he can still be improving this many years into his career. I'm excited that we can say that about Eddie Alvarez, especially because his first 3 fights in the UFC did not give the impression that he was going to be doing things he hadn't done before in his shot at the UFC title. It kind of looked... I mean, we're talking about a guy who lost his debut and then had 2 split decisions, both over faded contenders, and then just knocked out the champion in spectacular fashion. In a performance, too, that I don't think really looked like a lucky shot kind of performance. It looked like Eddie Alvarez had a real plan for how to approach Rafael dos Anjos. He wasn't necessarily winning the first round, but he was very calm and collected the entire way. He looked better than he did in either of his 3 previous UFC performances, or indeed in many of his Bellator performances. And yeah, I'm just excited because Eddie Alvarez is such an easy fighter to like, such an easy guy to root for, and such an exciting fighter. It's really good to see him, like I suppose some of the other champions before him, guys like RDA and Robbie Lawler, reaching a new form at what basically should be the final stage of his career.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting because to me that RDA fight solidified my thoughts of like what Eddie Alvarez was actually good at, like where his real wheelhouse was. You know what I mean? Like Alvarez, when he went to the Black Zillions, when he was working with Henry Hooft, like there was no question that like he improved some of his technical skills, like he got better at doing certain things. But I think that was the wrong fit for him. I think that was the wrong stylistic stylistic fit for him. I think it was the wrong kind of mental fit for him, and the wrong coaching style for him. And now that he's back with Mark Henry, I think you can see the kinds of technical improvements, but also a coaching style that actually matches his mentality and what he wants to be doing in fights. You know?
Yeah. So, I mean, for Eddie Alvarez too, I think he's a pretty emotional fighter. He gets caught up in the fight. We know that about him, that he can be goaded into a brawl. I think it makes sense for him to have a trainer in his corner who has a very cerebral, strategic approach to the game. Kind of like Jose Aldo having Andre Pederneiras, somebody who sees the big picture and sort of tries to focus those instincts or even dull them away when necessary. Whereas a guy like Henry Hooft, I think, really plays to that kind of uber masculinity of his fighters, and that's probably not what you want for a guy like Eddie Alvarez, who is already going in there with a chip on his shoulder. You don't want to like fan the flames of his pride and basically what seemed like in a lot of those fights to be kind of encourage him to go toe to toe. And to put his stamp on the fight. And then the result is like an unimpressive fight where he doesn't manage to put his stamp on it or fades late. You kind of take away what makes Eddie Alvarez good, which is that uneasy alliance of brawler's, slugger's heart and boxing ability. And so I think it's great that he has Mark Henry, because in that RDA fight, it really seemed like that boxing ability had been honed for the first time in a couple of years.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And so, I mean, I think okay, if we're going to lay out this matchup,
yeah,
I think that it's fairly clear what McGregor is going to try and do, what the broad outlines of his plan are going to be. He's going to want to come forward and pressure Alvarez toward the fence like RDA did. And that's we've never really seen at the most basic level a different plan from McGregor than that. It seems fairly certain that that's going to be his approach to that. But it's interesting because that gives Alvarez basically has 2 different ways of playing this. He can try and do what we saw in the Rafael dos Anjos fight, kind of where his most natural skill lies, and be an outside fighter, let McGregor come to him, lace him with counters, and try and stick and move, kind of try and play that game.
Specifically as a counterpuncher, I think is really his strongest single skill set.
Yeah, exactly. So he can try and play to his strengths and do that, or he can try to do what he did to Anthony Pettis and to a lesser extent Melendez and get right out of the gate and try and pressure McGregor. I think these are two disparate strategies. They both have things to recommend them. I think that the pressuring game plan is something that Alvarez is less comfortable with, but it's probably less risky, and it plays more to the wrestling advantage that he should have. Conversely, he's going to be more comfortable, I think, sticking and moving and letting McGregor come to him, but he runs a greater risk of getting stuck on the end of McGregor's reach, of getting caught against the fence a couple of times, eating some big inside angle left hands, and then getting stuck into a place where he has to brawl just to make things happen. So those are, I mean, they're both viable plans for him. I think that he's capable of winning the fight both ways. What do you think, Connor? Like, what do you think Alvarez is going to try and do here?
Yeah, my thought for this, and I'm in the process of still figuring this out because I'm working on 2 articles for this fight. I'm doing a how Conor McGregor wins and a how Eddie Alvarez wins, trying to strategize for both guys because I think the matchup offers unique challenges for both of them. I don't think either guy has an easy fight in his hands if he just does what he normally does. And there are a lot of variables based on the way they could react. Like, I don't really know specifically how Conor McGregor will approach Eddie Alvarez. Like you said, I assume he'll pressure. That seems to be his natural inclination, at least these days. And, you know, if anything, he's kind of always been a bit of a pressure fighter, maybe in the sense of like a Demetrius Johnson, where he wasn't always constantly coming forward, but he did like to constantly have the initiative, and pressure was his most reliable way to do that. Nowadays, he seems to have really... The big change from McGregor seems to be volume, that he pressures with more volume, that he throws more punches, and that he stays in range more frequently, that he's more aggressive with his pressuring game. More of a pressure fighter, I guess. And so for Eddie Alvarez, assuming that that's what McGregor is going to do, I would kind of like to see maybe a 2-stage game plan. I think it makes sense to try to pressure McGregor out of the gate, to make him wrestle, to keep the jab on him, to not allow him to dictate the pace of the fight, and then to do what Eddie Alvarez is comfortable doing as the fight progresses. I don't know what Conor McGregor is going to look like stamina-wise. I have a vague hope that fighting at 155 pounds for the first time in several years will be the cure to his obvious conditioning issues. Or I guess I could call them stamina issues, because he seems to be well conditioned in terms of how much work he does, although it doesn't seem to have the desired effect. I can't say with any kind of scientific certainty what the effects of cutting weight or adding weight are on somebody's stamina. I've heard a lot of people say, I think he faded a little bit in some of his featherweight fights, I guess most notably in the Chad Mendes fight, but he very smartly basically kept Mendes less energetic than him, so it never really became a problem, which I think you'll have to do here. But then he faded really badly in both of the Nate Diaz fights at welterweight. And so a lot of people have said, maybe you have some insight on this, Pat. A lot of people have talked about how, it makes you gas really badly to add on a lot of weight. I don't actually know if that's true. To go from what I imagine he was walking around at about 155, 160, something like that, and then they go up to 170 and come in at about 168. I don't know if that actually makes you gas. I don't think McGregor added a considerable amount of muscle. I think he just probably didn't cut as much water, if any at all. So McGregor size-wise was walking between 172 and 175 when he was fighting at featherweight. Those are the reports that I've heard, fairly reliable ones. And I think for his last couple of fights, he was around 180 at his walking around weight, and then was making the cut. He may have been pretty dang lean when he actually started his water cut. He may have been like 170 or 170, 175. Yeah, just looking at him, he seems very lean in general.
Yeah, so I would guess that the cut to lightweight should not be a huge one. It goes both ways, though. I think for the most part, yes, there is no question that cutting weight takes something away from your performance. In the best case scenarios, with the best methods of rehydration, the best nutrition going in, you get something like 96% of your pre-cut performance back. That was based on the program that GSP was using, which is kind of by consensus the most advanced one.
That's an
designed by
cut.
PhD.
That's an optimal cut.
As an optimal baseline. So somebody tried this out and then did the numbers with VO2 max and stamina and all of that, everything that you could do They did it following his plan to a T, one that had been designed by a PhD nutritionist and like PhD kinesiologists and all of that good stuff. But with that said, when you cut down a little more, there's also more incentive to do cardio. Like Cyborg was running 7 miles a day to make doing 7 miles of road work a day to make her cut down to 140. Mm-hmm. So if you don't have to do that much road work in order just to get the weight off, maybe you may not have the stamina despite not having to cut as much water and go through that.
But simply going up in weight shouldn't have that dramatic of an effect on stamina, right? Like there might be corollary things that it affects. So. Yeah, I don't see the science there. I've heard this tossed around a lot, and like I said, I don't understand the science. It's certainly possible, but I've never seen a case before of a fighter, for example, coming in on short notice and therefore fighting considerably heavier than they did the first time and gassing that badly. So I'm holding out vague hope that McGregor looks really good and fresh for more than 2 rounds against Eddie Alvarez because he's fighting at 155, which seems like it would be his optimal weight based on his build and his walking around weight. But it's really hard to say with any kind of certainty that that'll be the case. And in fact, I think it's a lot more tempting to guess that he probably will have stamina issues if this fight goes past the second round.
Yeah, but I want to come back to this a little bit for a couple of different reasons. Because why are we letting Eddie Alvarez off the hook for that? Alvarez faded badly in the second and third round against Donald Cerrone, really badly. And that was a 3-round fight. It wasn't at altitude. He just got worn down with Cerrone's kicking game and his body work. He got badly beat up as that fight went on. He was gassed in the third round. He was gassed and he was beat up. He faded badly in his first fight with Michael Chandler. More than anything, why he got choked out at the end of that fight was because he was exhausted. That was the 4th round of that fight. And not it was quick paced, but it was not Diaz McGregor 1 or 2 pace. You know what I mean? And on the other side of that, I think part of the reason why McGregor gassed as hard as he did, especially in the first fight against Diaz, was because he was fighting a taller guy and he had to cover more distance. He had to explode a lot more.
Sure.
And I think when McGregor is in charge of the range, when McGregor is dictating the range at which the fight takes place, I think that gassing is less of an issue. He doesn't have to explode quite the same way. Now, does that mean he's not going to gas against Eddie Alvarez? No, absolutely not. But it also doesn't mean that we have to spot Alvarez the stamina advantage from the get-go and say, well, if he can get it into the later rounds, he's obviously going to be the more conditioned fighter, especially if McGregor is a trident, especially if he works the legs and he works the body.
So that's my point. I'm going to disagree with you a little bit. I'm going to say that Alvarez, I think, does have a track record that proves that he's certainly capable of fighting 3 rounds without tiring at a pretty good pace. He tends to keep a good output. He gets into some crazy exchanges. He almost always gets hurt, which a lot of people, trainers will tell you taxes the conditioning and requires good conditioning to overcome. And yet he comes back and turns in a lot of good decision performances, and we have seen him. We know that he can go 5 rounds without looking decidedly awful, or at least without having gassed until the later rounds, right? I wouldn't say Chad Mendez's cardio against Jose Aldo looked questionable because he didn't get tired until round 4, and that fight was an insane pace. So I would say that's kind of reasonable. You expect the fighters to get tired. Most fighters are going to get tired. So I think Eddie Alvarez does have that. But the Cerrone fight and what you just said about McGregor's strategy is a very valuable point. I think whether we're operating on the baseline that Alvarez's cardio is no better than McGregor's or not, I personally think that it probably is. It makes a lot of sense for Conor McGregor to make every effort possible to do what he did to Chad Mendes, to keep Eddie Alvarez from ever surpassing the amount of gas that McGregor himself has in the tank, to always keep Alvarez's gas tank a little leakier and a little more shallow than his own. So I think for Conor McGregor, against a guy like Alvarez, who can fight at a crazy clip, who does have good stamina, maybe not like Nate Diaz levels of insane stamina, but good stamina, I think it makes a lot of sense to work his body early and often. And specifically, I think if McGregor's smart, he'll come into this fight working a lot of straight shots to the body, really taking advantage of the fact that he has a pretty significant reach advantage, 5 inches, I think, over a guy who is normally fights in a higher weight class than him. And also, to stifle Alvarez's wrestling. So if we see McGregor come into this fight, what I expect to see from a well-prepared McGregor, or at least if McGregor wins, these are the things I expect will happen. I think we'll see him pressure a lot from the get-go, but from a distance, not coming in and wading in with punches, because it's not good that Alvarez brawls, but it's also not wise for McGregor to brawl with him. He's going to want to take advantage of the fact that he's so much bigger and that he's such a better long-range fighter. And I think we're going to see McGregor attack the body a lot with straight shots and straight kicks from long range to keep Alvarez from ducking under and closing the gap, and to keep him at long range and to give that the stopping power. People really tend to underrate the ability of something as simple as like a jab to the chest to stop takedowns. It's effective. There's stopping power when you hit somebody in the torso that doesn't exist when you might glance off their forehead as they duck down. And oftentimes, if you aim for the chest with a shot, they will duck their chin into it as they change levels. So I think that's a brilliant tactic that McGregor can use and has used in the past to keep Alvarez from getting in on his hips. And, I think that might be enough. He's got good reactive counter wrestling abilities. He can get caught off guard because he overextends and pressures so aggressively, but Eddie Alvarez is also not Chad Mendes. I don't think he's going to consistently and easily just blast McGregor off of his feet the way Mendes did.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with that. I expect to see, as you said, a pressuring McGregor, but I think we'll see a much more measured kind of pressure. Basically, I would say the kind of game plan he had against Nate Diaz the second time, I would expect to be his default.
Right.
I would he's going to want to push him back. I don't think we're going to see a lot of energy intensive spinning kicks. I think he'll throw round kicks. I think he'll throw some stepping knees. I think we'll see some front kicks from him. I don't think we're going to see a lot of the spinning stuff. I feel like he's kind of off of that, or at least hopefully is, because most of that was not helpful for him. Like wheel kicks, there's no reason for Conor McGregor to be throwing wheel kicks. The spinning back kicks do serve a purpose for him in terms of his pressure game, but not so much the really, really flashy stuff. Okay, but so kind of in general, this was something that I wanted to get to. I would expect McGregor to try and back him up, but like you said, not to wade in. I think he's going to try and draw out Alvarez's kind of stick and move game, and he's going to try and counter it. If there's an evolution that we've seen from Conor McGregor, I mean, he's gotten a lot better. Going back through and watching all of his fights, culminating with the Diaz one, I think we finally saw a bunch of the stuff that he'd been working on for a while kind of come to full fruition. I would assume a lot of the stuff that he had prepped for Jose Aldo, a lot of the stuff that he had prepped when he was going to fight Rafael dos Anjos, and finally everything that he had to prepare for the second Diaz fight. He is not the same fighter he was when he fought Chad Mendes. He's not the same fighter he was when he fought Dennis Seaver. No. It's just the biggest change, I think, is in the quality of his counterpunching game, the quality and variety of his counterpunching game. And to avoid gassing, I think that we might see him take his foot off of the pedal and try and play more of an aggressive countering game, something more like what Anthony Johnson does than the kind of straightforward pin him against the fence and just unload left hand after left hand kind of thing. Yeah,
absolutely. Let's take a quick break, actually, because I do want to talk a lot more about that. But if I could go on now, then this segment will go way over. So we'll take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about Conor McGregor pressuring with the intent of finding counters and how and why that might work particularly well against Eddie Alvarez. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out, the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it. And we are back. Going into the break, we said we wanted to talk about Conor McGregor drawing Eddie Alvarez out using his pressure and countering him with an aggressive pressure fighting game. First, let's talk about why that works so well for Conor McGregor, and then we'll talk about why I think that's a very good strategy against Eddie Alvarez. We'll talk about that second. So Pat, you had something you wanted to say, I think, about why that is playing to Conor McGregor's strength.
Well, so I think that this is kind of what he's been moving toward for a while. I think that this has been something that he's been working on for a long time, and now we're finally seeing it fully flower and come to fruition. Because for a long time, he always liked to counter, and his pressure always enabled that. I will always think, to me, the defining shot of Conor McGregor's career is the backstepping left hand that he used to just knock Ivan Buchinger's block off.
Yeah,
it's the same punch in a little bit slower motion that he used to knock out Jose Aldo. For me, that was always kind of the characteristic. This makes us understand what Conor McGregor is all about, kind of thing.
I would say that the Buchinger knockout, I think, was actually a prettier example of that punch
than the Aldo one.
Yeah, the Aldo one is more impressive because of who it's against, but it's kind of also McGregor like not quite getting the footwork perfect and having to kind of improvise. The Buchinger one is like a textbook hop, step, slip, and counter.
Yeah, it's a beautiful shot.
Yeah.
And so we've always known that he's had this in him, but what we saw in the second Diaz fight was a much greater array of counters at his disposal.
Yeah.
He was hitting cross counters, he was hitting same time counters, he was hitting half beat counters, he was hitting pull counters, like he was hitting when the angles were there, he was hitting the kinds of counters that that kind of inside angle thing that he liked. These were all available options for him, and now I think we're going to see the full flowering of those against the kinds of orthodox opponents that his game is better against than Diaz. Like, the problem when he was fighting Nate Diaz was always that he was fighting a taller southpaw with a better lead hand. And it was kind of a uniquely difficult matchup for McGregor, who is really kind of designed to beat same size or smaller orthodox fighters. Like, that's really his wheelhouse. And so much of his game was predicated on that he had to get outside of his comfort zone to beat Diaz. And the way that he did that was by digging deeper into something that he was moving towards in the first place, which was his counters. And it was more efficient. It saved him more energy. He got to rely on his timing more, which has always been kind of his best facet. And now he gets to finally put that to use. So I would say that when he goes up against Alvarez, he's going to be well served to stick with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's kind of, we've kind of seen the pieces of this game come together. I think him being more comfortable in the pocket and throwing more volume. That's something we saw in the fights with Dennis Seaver or the fight with Diego Brandao. Him, of course, being more of a pressure fighter, we saw that more aggressive with his pressure. We saw that happening over the course of basically his entire UFC career, aside from his debut, and then kind of bringing back in some of the counterpunching tendency that I think he really favored early in his career in his most recent fights against Nate Diaz, both times against Nate Diaz. We saw some really, really nice defense and counterpunching, the likes of which we haven't seen from McGregor before. And then coupled in with the kind of pressure he keeps, it made him look really effective until maybe that tactic wore on him. And maybe there's something to be said about how this game may be the most dangerous and yet the most vulnerable Conor McGregor. It may be a really big gambit for him to play this kind of high volume, close distance, middle distance, I suppose. It still tends to take advantage of his reach and his build, but the kind of intensity of this style of counterpunching may actually be very difficult for him to sustain. So we will have to see. Well,
but see, again, I think Nate Diaz is kind of a uniquely difficult challenge in that regard because he gives you so much volume to work with that if you're a counterpuncher and you're going to be drawn into kind of responding to what your opponent gives you the way that McGregor seems to be going to, like, Eddie Alvarez is not going to throw that much.
Yeah.
You know? Like, he's not gonna try and throw 20 or 25 or 30 strikes a minute the way that Nate Diaz is. Like, I think that if Eddie Alvarez is throwing 15 strikes a minute, which is kind of his like where he tops out, if that's what he's doing, then I think McGregor can keep that pace. I don't think that's untenable for him, especially if he's the one who's dictating the action. If he's the one who's pressuring and he's got all that space to move the way that he wants to move, where he can be flowy and efficient the way that he wants to be, I don't think it's going to be as much of an issue. And in fact, like, if he's not going to have to be the one leading the dance all the time, like, he can keep himself in better control of how much he's throwing. I don't know. I'm just not inclined to buy that stamina is always going to be an issue for him.
You're not sold on the idea that it will always be a problem.
I want to see. Well, I mean, if he comes out here and he gasses hard in the third round against Eddie Alvarez, then yeah, okay, we'll go ahead and say that. But yeah. I really think that, like, Diaz is a unique opponent.
Yeah, you're basically your theory is that Conor McGregor takes counterpunches like a dog eats its bowl of food, and if you give him way too much food, he's still going to eat all of it until he gets sick. But if you give
I don't think he can help himself.
Yeah, right. But if you give him the right amount of food, he's going to do a really good job eating it up. That's Conor
Yeah.
McGregor with counters. He had a buffet of counter opportunities with Nate Diaz. It did seem like it was really hard for him to resist. Even in the second fight, he had to try so hard to resist following up on every single opportunity and really letting that game flourish because maybe there was so many openings for him to work with. I think that's a possibility. That maybe Eddie Alvarez won't present because he is decidedly a lower volume fighter. Not bad, but definitely a lower volume fighter than Nate Diaz.
We kind of saw the limits of the volume that Eddie Alvarez could throw in his fight with Donald Cerrone. I think, I would assume, because Mark Henry places more emphasis on volume, I would kind of assume that we'll see him push a faster, kind of a faster pace than he did back in the day. But when he was never like a super high volume guy. But I don't think we're going to see him suddenly turn into like a Frankie Edgar style pace.
Right. Well, and unlike Frankie, I think as we noted before, the thing with Eddie Alvarez is that he really is best on the counter. He is a stick and move kind of fighter. He will do a lot of things. He has a bit of slugger in him, that mentality that allows him to kind of the confidence to just kind of rush in or play counter or throw volume or whatever. He's very flexible in what he is willing to do. But technically, I think most of his expertise is limited to counterpunching. I think he has good timing. He has good defense when he's not punching. When he is actually focused on defending his opponent's shots and then coming back. And he's got a few good pot shots in his arsenal. But one thing that really stands out to me about Eddie Alvarez, and I think this makes him particularly vulnerable when it comes to McGregor's counters, is that not only is he kind of hittable when he leads in general, but he's a very, very right-hand dependent fighter. Especially for someone who was once and is now again a student of Mark Henry, who even McGregor, the best criticism he had of Mark Henry, aside from, I think, fat bitch is something that he called Mark, was that he was a double jab right hand pad man. Basically saying that he's a guy who works fundamentals. In McGregor's view, that was meant to be pejorative, like he's too basic. But even McGregor's insults imply this is a guy who likes fundamentals. And those of us who admire Mark Henry, and I'm sure there's a bit of an admiration for Mark inside Conor McGregor somewhere too, know that he really focuses on fundamentals. The jab being one of the most important of those. And yet, Eddie Alvarez is really right-hand happy. He's like the Andrei Arlovsky of lightweight fighters in that regard, that he often feints his jab, he often measures, but he very rarely sticks his opponent with his jab. And that means that when he leads, you kind of know it's coming. There's nothing that blinds you or snaps your head back or makes you wonder if something else is coming because you're so focused on the jab that's hitting you. Most of the time, when you see him feint that jab and step forward, you know you have to watch out for the right hand.
And he's much more likely to throw a 2-3 than he is a 1-2.
Absolutely, yeah.
As he moves forward, like he really, and he's got a nice lead right. It's not the world's easiest to predict lead right.
No.
Like
he's got some variety to it too, and he likes a weird, awkward lead uppercut, all kinds of stuff. But all of that's risky, and especially so in a southpaw matchup. Because I'm really glad that you mentioned this because it hit at something that I was trying to get at earlier when I was talking about the different game plans he might employ here. Yeah,
like Eddie Alvarez is part of the reason why the answer to this fight is not just go after him and pressure is because of something exactly you said. When Alvarez leads, he is way hittable.
Yes,
really hittable.
Absolutely.
And that came through really clearly when he fought Anthony Pettis. And like he just kind of made the decision that he was going to walk through Pettis's punches. Yeah. You know? And
you don't want to do that against McGregor.
Yeah, but his defense kind of disappears when he decides he's going to go into pressure mode. He's like, okay, well, I guess I'm marching you down now, and I've got to take whatever you throw at me. Like, that's why he can't just come out and say, okay, well, I'm gonna go straight at him, and have that be like the objectively best plan here.
Right.
So if he plays a kind of a more of a stick and move game and tries to counter McGregor when he comes forward, like that is he's putting himself in McGregor's wheelhouse, but he is almost paradoxically in less danger of running into the big shot.
Right. Well, I mean, that's what the same thing. Like you don't want to let Rafael dos Anjos pressure you, but it worked for Eddie Alvarez. And it may in fact be the same idea against McGregor. I think McGregor has some advantages, some disadvantages too, but some advantages over RDA in that kind of fight. But it may be the best way for Eddie Alvarez to go, is to just let McGregor pressure and to use like traditional tactics to make that pressure less effective, to fight a really tactical fight with McGregor. Come in here and say, I'm going to try to match him for volume. I'm going to counter him whenever he throws, just like I did to RDA. I'm going to make him move and make him chase me. And then occasionally I'm going to shoot for a takedown when he gets overconfident and make him work. And that will allow me to maybe take over as the fight goes on if he does indeed start to slow down. But that I think a big part of that hitability is, I mean, Eddie is kind of a flip the switch kind of fighter with his offense and defense, regardless of what he's doing. Even when he's counterpunching, if he sees you coming in and he's like, all right, I'm going to plant my feet and throw counter punches, he's hittable. His chin comes up, his shoulders kind of bunched together. He's got bad posture, which makes him a little more hittable and a little more hurtable as well. And his head remains pretty stationary, and he just kind of wings punches from the hip. But when he's focused on defense, he's pretty good. He's moves his feet really, really well. He's got some of the best footwork in this division, and he knows how to slip punches. He knows how to keep a tight guard and how to parry. When he's focused on defense, he's pretty hard to hit. It's just the marriage of the two. But that becomes an especially big problem when he's leading because of the fact that he does it so frequently using his right hand, a right hand lead. A lot of people talk about how the conventional wisdom is that the cross is the most dangerous weapon against an opponent of opposite stance, and that is true to a certain extent because it's a little easier to line up than the jab. But you don't want to go rear hand for rear hand with Conor McGregor. The advantage of the southpaw is that he fights pretty much only orthodox fighters. Granted, McGregor's fought actually quite a few southpaws, but for the most part, his tactics are really well designed for orthodox fighters. Those are the fighters that he absolutely slaughters, that he has no problem with. Fighters like Jose Aldo and Dennis Seaver, and those are the easy fights for him. Chad Mendez, not necessarily easy, but extenuating circumstances. You don't want to play the southpaw's game against such a practiced southpaw, and especially when he has a reach advantage, because the right hand is always, for an orthodox fighter, the farthest weapon from the target. It's always, as far as punches go, it takes the most time to go from its chambered position to full extension. It gives, and time, distance and time are inextricably linked. The more distance it has to cover, the more time the opponent has to react and either avoid it or counter it. And against a southpaw, that distance is even greater because the feet tend to run into each other. You have to do a lot more work to create angles just to get past your opponent's lead leg, and only then can you really be close enough to confidently land your rear hand. There's a lot more distance to cover. And I think that's something that McGregor will use. He's very good at creating space for his punches when he needs to, even off of his pressure, that quick hop step backwards. And I think Alvarez is going to run into trouble if he fights with those same tactics. I think there is a desperate need for Eddie Alvarez in this fight to work his left hand. I think it is the most invaluable weapon in his arsenal against McGregor. More valuable than his wrestling, more valuable than his kicks. He needs to work his left hand, and encouragingly, he did that much better than usual against Dos Anjos. So I think he's probably headed in the right direction, but I don't know whether or not it'll be enough.
So kind of on that note, we've spent a lot of time talking about this. What's your prediction? How do you think the fight goes down?
Well, there are, I think, it feels, let me quickly say that I think Eddie Alvarez has some of the same things in his corner as Nate Diaz that makes it tempting to pick him. A few unique things, and a few things that Nate definitely didn't have that will give him a big disadvantage. He does not have Nate's build, and I think that's a big part of why McGregor gassed, as you said, Pat, and also why McGregor was so much more hittable than we're using, even with better defensive tactics, why those fights were so difficult for him, because of the size difference, and he is much better when he is the larger, longer fighter. So he doesn't have that in his corner. He does have the boxing footwork. He has the craft and the experience, that sort of journeyman style that Nate Diaz used to just kind of outsmart McGregor at times. And he doesn't have Nate's chin, but he does have Nate's mental toughness. He is very, very... I mean, Eddie Alvarez, it is an absolute miracle that he has been dropped or stunned as many times as he has, and never once since 2007 has he been knocked out. He was knocked out once very early in his career. It's pretty remarkable. I don't know if you find that as amazing as I do. The guy gets hurt all the time, and he's never.
He goes so far as telling refs that like, oh, don't worry if I get hurt, give me a little extra leash
Yeah.
because I will recover.
Sometimes
is more or less what he says.
Right. Sometimes it wakes him up even, and some fighters are like that. So he does have that in his favor. You don't want to get hurt by McGregor. The guy's an excellent finisher when he has you hurt. But a lot of guys also tend to fold when they get hurt, and we know Eddie Alvarez won't do that. He's going to fight back. He's going to recuperate and try to get back into the fight. And he has won a lot of fights after being hurt early. So those are things in his favor. But there are also a couple of things that Conor McGregor has in his favor that Eddie Alvarez doesn't. You know, he has a build that is much better suited to southpaw tactics. He has a build that is much better suited to pressuring without walking into Eddie Alvarez's counters. And I think he is more comfortable off the back foot than Dos Anjos. I don't think McGregor likes to be pressured, but I think the Nate Diaz fights are great evidence of that when he was being walked down, he wasn't doing well. And, of course, that coincided with his gas tank fading. But he's definitely – his game doesn't kind of shut off when he's being pressured the way that we've kind of learned that RDA's does. So he's got more flexibility than RDA should the fight go past the point at which Dos Anjos was knocked out. So basically we have a sort of tenuous feeling that Conor McGregor could be the first man in a long, long time to knock Eddie Alvarez out early, which is his specialty, early finishes. And I think that's a distinct possibility. And then we have the chance that Eddie Alvarez can do a little bit of what Nate Diaz did, which is outlast McGregor a bit, make him work, and just constantly have answers for what he's trying to do and win the fight as it goes on. That's a pretty simplistic look of the fight, but generally those I think are the two major possibilities. And for me, I have decided to side with Conor McGregor by early KO. I just think Eddie Alvarez is a little too hittable. I would love to see him make some dramatic technical improvements, but I just think his mentality of when I get hit, I throw back, and when I'm throwing, I'm not defending, I think that's very risky against the kind of game that Conor McGregor employs. I don't think you want to – he's maybe the last guy in this division or at 145 who you want to engage in a like toe-to-toe fight with. So – especially because he's going to make it from his side not a toe-to-toe fight. He's going to be cutting angles and moving his head and his feet and layering his attacks. And Eddie Alvarez, we know, has a habit of just settling his feet in place and doing the Renan Barão thing, just swinging with both hands. And I see that happening early. At some point, as soon as McGregor starts tagging him, which I'm sure he will in the first round, and I think that leads to the first KO for Eddie Alvarez in a long time. I think first round KO for McGregor is my pick.
Yeah, I think it'll take a little longer, but I also think McGregor is going to knock him out. The only I would not be surprised if Alvarez found himself some success in this fight, either by pressuring and shoving McGregor up against the fence and kind of wearing on him a little bit. I would not be surprised if he had a lot of success countering Conor McGregor. But both of those game plans that I laid out, I think are just too risky at the end of the day. I think that the basic dynamic of this fight is going to be whether Alvarez's chin can handle McGregor's straight left, because McGregor is going to find ways to land it. If Alvarez pressures, then he risks coming right in and eating and getting caught up in McGregor's angle counter game. And I don't think that that's a thing that Alvarez can handle as he moves straight in. I think that there's a lot of craft to what McGregor wants to do as a counter puncher. He's not easy to get in on. Like when he's playing with the distance, when he's in command of the distance, it is not easy to get a clean shot at his hips for a takedown. And conversely, if he tries to play that kind of stick and move game, I think he's going to get caught on the end of McGregor's reach. That's the big difference between McGregor and RDA.
Yes.
Is McGregor fights so much longer than Dos Anjos does. Dos Anjos will fight with some length. He'll use his front kicks. He'll use his straight left. He'll use his round kicks. But really, Dos Anjos wants to ball his way into the pocket and go to work. Like that's the basis of Dos Anjos' game. Yeah. McGregor is not that guy. McGregor wants to stick you on the very, very end of his reach, and that is a long reach. That's a lot of distance to have to cover, especially for a shorter guy with shorter limbs like Alvarez.
Yeah, so despite the difference between their tactics, it's a very similar style, just at a different range. You know, keep yourself in a position that feels threatening. The biggest thing for guys like RDA and McGregor is to look and feel threatening at all times. You got to convince the opponent that they have to be worried about you because you're too close not to worry about, and you hit too hard not to worry about, and you're too willing to throw not to worry about. But McGregor has the distinct advantage that for him, that distance is considerably longer.
It's about 3-4 inches longer than
if
Dos
not
Anjos
more at
is.
times, because not just are his limbs longer than Dos Anjos is by a few inches, but his tactics are longer. He's more willing to kind of really time a shot and reach in over a long distance. He catches a lot of guys, especially with that inside angle left hand, when they do not think they're vulnerable to be hit. And that's not something that RDA, you know you're vulnerable all the time. Conor, you often think you're escaping, and then you get knocked down.
I mean, that's actually that's his meat and potatoes.
Yeah.
That's his bread and butter, is when he backs you up to the fence. You think you're safe. You think you've got space to angle out. You overcommit to the outside angle. He pivots and he lands the inside angle punch across the plane of your body. That's when the tide turned against Chad Mendes. That's when the tide turned against Dennis Seaver. That is his most devastating shot. And if you get caught with it, man, it's a question of whether your chin can handle it or not. I think at the end of the day, either of those game plans, there's just too much risk for us to confidently pick Eddie Alvarez. Yeah. So I'd take McGregor by knockout in the second round after wearing a bit. I think he's gonna get hit quite a bit before we get there.
Yeah, because if he doesn't put Eddie down, it's gonna become a bit of a brawl. And if Eddie does start throwing those wild punches, yes, he's gonna get really hittable. But I mean, especially going with your theory, McGregor's gonna throw back. And I think that may be the most dangerous and the most vulnerable thing about Conor McGregor. That's the thing that surprised Jose Aldo. He did not expect that Conor McGregor would be ready with a bomb of a counter for the first attack he tried. And he was. That's his thing. When you come at him, he is ready to hit you. And so that's kind of the mentality of both guys when things get messy. So I can absolutely see a war in the first round, because I don't think Eddie Alvarez is going to go quietly into that good night. I just think that ultimately he will end up, going Betty by. The thing is that we should point out, disclaimer, I don't think we've picked a single Conor McGregor fight correctly since his fight with Chad Mendes. So, disclaimer, the man is just a maelstrom of opinion. He is the eye of the storm. His fights are hard to call. He's an enigma. And Eddie Alvarez is kind of an enigma, too. He's a little like Nate Diaz in that respect. So who the fuck knows?
I have literally picked against Eddie Alvarez every fight going back to... I think the last time I picked him to win a fight was the rematch with Michael Chandler. I thought he would beat Michael Chandler in their rematch.
Right. So these are two guys that neither of us can successfully predict their fights that often. They're both tough to get a handle on. So really the most confident assertion we can make is that this should be an exciting fight. Whether it lasts 30 seconds or 25 minutes, I can pretty much guarantee there's going to be some really interesting action. And that's what I'm most excited about.
Yeah, I'm with you.
All right. Well, let's take one more break. When we come back, we're going to talk about the other two big fights that we wanted to discuss from UFC 205, namely the welterweight title clash between the second newly crowned champion we've talked about today, Tyron Woodley and Stephen Thompson, and a welterweight match between Kelvin Gastelum and Donald Cerrone. Financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are one or two of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. And you can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show. And we are rolling. Let's go ahead and talk first about the title fight. Pat, we've got, again, the welterweight championship contested between Tyron Woodley, Stephen Thompson. I am both proud and saddened by the fact that I successfully predicted Tyron Woodley to knock out Robbie Lawler in the first round. No one wants to see Brutal Bob go down like that. But the man is dangerous, and I think consistently underestimated for what makes him so dangerous. He's an easy fighter to discount because his strengths seem so simple, but they're such dramatic strengths that the sort of limited array of his abilities, it is not as big a problem as it would be for other fighters.
Yeah, I mean, I think that people mistake the stripped down nature of his game for simplicity. And I don't think that his game is simple. I think that there's a lot of complexity to what he's trying to do out there and how he wants to do it. But it's it's kind of intangible complexity more than it is like something that you can just point to this and say, oh, this is very deep what he's doing out there. No, it's because it's all about very subtly gauging the distance and then knowing exactly how far to explode in and knowing when to explode in. Okay. It's a matter of timing. It's a matter of timing and space, and he's very, very good at that. Like, you don't catch Brutal Bob Lawler unaware with the kind of right hand he did unless you've done some stuff to set it up. Yes. It's very hard to like put a GIF out there and point to it and say, oh, look what he did here. Like that's not you don't get any closer to understanding Tyron Woodley's game by doing that.
Can that guy be a recurring character, by the way? This new character you've unveiled for the show? Look at this right here.
Yeah, it's. I was about to say something unkind about another analyst, and I chose not to.
Oh,
I chose not to go there.
Pat, I told you to stop talking shit about me on our own show. Come on, we have to share our production
here. Shit too. It's somebody else.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah. It is. I agree with you. It is kind of the thing where, as an analyst, you kind of have to just step back and say, like, this is how it is. Like, you can say this is how he sets it up, but you can't really explain in a really mechanical way why it works for Tyron Woodley the way it doesn't for others. He just has great timing. He has incredible speed and power, and that's kind of it. There's a lot of nuance to how he uses his game, but if you look at it from the perspective that we usually use to look at fighters' arsenals, it is limited. It's mostly a right hand and a right leg, and even his shot takedowns aren't that good for a wrestler. Mostly Tyron Woodley is moving around. He's blocking, parrying, stepping away, pretty good defensively, underrated in that regard, I've always said, and he's looking to land the right hand. And so that seems like really reductive to people, and it makes it seem like, how could this guy possibly get his way to a title? But he's dangerous. He's very, very dangerous, and he knows how to work that game. Successful fighting is often not about having a really textbook approach to fighting, but about, being able to write a text out of what you already do well. And that's Tyron Woodley. He knows how to use what he possesses, even if he doesn't possess what certain trainers and critics and analysts might want him to possess.
Yeah, it's a very stripped down, efficient game, and it maximizes his physicality while minimizing some of the problems with his approach. And there are problems. Like there's no reason, if you're Tyron Woodley, you shouldn't go out there and fight like Ioana Jędrzejczyk does.
No,
that is not a good use of your physical characteristics. That's what works for one fighter does not necessarily work for another. And Woodley is really, really good at maximizing what he does well. Yeah. Now, with that said, it also kind of leaves a gap for us because, frankly, we can say what we've said, but there isn't a whole lot else for us to say. It's kind of, okay, you got to watch Tyron Woodley to understand it. It's hard for us to paint a word picture.
And it doesn't mean that he has found a good way to make his game work. Does not by any means mean that it is foolproof. I would absolutely like to see Tyron Woodley jab more. I would absolutely like to see Tyron Woodley show more urgency in getting off the fence and use better footwork in doing so. And I would like to see him be maybe a little more willing to counter with that right hand when he has opportunities. And again, that comes from being more comfortable moving the right way to be in a position to land it, not have to explode across so much space. There are problems in his game, and I think we have to look at those when we predict his fight with Stephen Thompson. So
yeah, because those issues, the ones that you pointed to there, are exactly what's going to get him into trouble in this match.
Sure. So why don't you give the breakdown of how Stephen Thompson matches up with Woodley?
Well, so this is just a god-awful matchup for Tyron Woodley. I mean, I think that it's hard to look at the welterweight division, all of the raft of available fighters, and say that there's anybody that is a more brutal matchup for Woodley than this one. Simply because we mentioned exploding across distance as being, and timing as being, real strengths of Woodley's game. While kind of his weaknesses are, I would say, ring craft in general. He's not really great at commanding the space of the cage.
Yeah.
He's too easily backed up. He doesn't manipulate distance very well. He's good at gauging it, but I don't think he does a good job of controlling it.
Yes.
And those are exactly Stephen Thompson's strengths. Stephen Thompson excels at setting the distance, manipulating it, playing with it, and getting you to bite into the kinds of distances that he wants you to be fighting at. That's why Thompson has trouble with taller, longer fighters who can play a distance game with him. Where Thompson does not struggle with are shorter fighters or guys who don't have great ring craft, where he can stick them on the outside and just play and play and play and play and dig into a well of possible responses so deep that it's very difficult for you to come up with any sort of coherent response.
Yeah, manipulation is the key word with Stephen Thompson. There's sort of one of those. He's one of those guys who has an element of mind control almost to his game, where he can constantly play with your perception of what the space between your body and his body actually is. He moves his upper body and keeps his feet planted. He's always got the side kick and the jab ready. And personally, I think the side kick is a really great weapon for distance management, possibly more versatile in some ways than the jab, because again, hitting the body, hitting the hip, hitting the chest, great stopping power in that. You can keep somebody from walking through the shot. Whereas if you hit somebody's head with a jab, you are likely to glance off the side or the top. A side kick doesn't have that same possibility in the same way. But also, it allows him to be really free with the way he stands and sets up his other strikes. Because the thing with a jab is you can't throw it with any effect behind your shoulder. You can be very side on and throw it with, not much power, but you can still snap it if you're like in a skateboard stance. The side kick can still be thrown when the person is actually behind you. And so it allows Thompson to have a really stalwart way of stopping people from angling around his lead foot, which is great for him because he really likes to create those open stance engagements. He likes to make it so that he's in the opposite stance of his opponent. He basically did that all night to Rory McDonald and stopped Rory from ever getting anything of meaning done, because he just could not get past that lead leg, and because he couldn't get around it, the flexibility of that side kick keeping him from doing so, he was lost for options. Now, Woodley's more explosive in covering that distance, and there's the interesting facet that maybe of Tyron Woodley's opponents, there is no one more likely to be controlled or dominated on the ground than Stephen Thompson, but there is also no one who is harder to get at in the way that Woodley typically does than Stephen Thompson.
Yeah, so a few different things there. Yeah, I mean, the side kick is kind of the foundation of Thompson's distance management game, but he also has a nice jab. He throws a jab constantly. It's that he has a whole different array of tools for controlling you at different ranges. The jabbing range is different from the side kicking range, which is slightly different from the front kicking range, which is different from the round kicking range, which is different from blitzing range. Like, he has all of these different ways of messing with your understanding of the space between you and exploiting that space. So basically, once he has created this gap between you, once he has enforced this range, whether he would prefer to be at kind of jabbing distance or whether he'd prefer to be at kicking distance, that gives him two options. He can either blitz in with combinations, and he's a tricky blitzer. I would say more tricky than somebody like Lyoto Machida. Like, he has a lot of different angles that he can attack you from. He can kind of attack you straight on, or he can kind of blitz to the side. He can blitz to an outside angle or an inside angle. These are all options for him. And then he gets out on a different line. Or I think he's more dangerous when he sets that distance and baits you into crossing it. He is a devastating counterpuncher, a really tricky counterpuncher. He likes the same kind of inside angle left hand that Conor McGregor throws so well. But he's got more kind of options for the precise angles that he takes than even somebody like McGregor. Like, he is a master of that punch and throws it early and often. So he sets this distance, he manipulates it, and then he creates this whole flow chart of options for himself in terms of how he can play with that. And that's just really, really difficult for somebody with a stripped down game like Woodley's to deal with. I mean, because I could see Woodley surprising him early, just like exploding across that distance, landing a big shot, and putting Thompson out. Like, that's perfectly plausible way of looking at this. What I have a hard time seeing is how once Thompson has succeeded in messing with that distance, Woodley has a successively less chance of being able to cross it as the fight goes on.
It's the same problem I mentioned with Eddie Alvarez. Like, if you're flashing your jab and trying to get your opponent's hand down or whatever, how are you going to convince Stephen Thompson, who's 6 feet away, that he's threatened until he knows you're close enough to hit him? Until he can touch you, he knows you can't touch him, so you need to have more complexity to your setups and to your footwork to fool him into thinking that he can't be hit or that he can be hit. You can't manipulate the distance with Thompson until you sort of match his understanding of distance, or you force him to respect something. And if all he respects is the crazy rush, then, he knows he has to watch out for it. He knows he has to watch out for that big lunge. It's much easier for him to avoid it then.
Yeah, so I had a long conversation with Thompson about a week ago. Interviews going up shortly. Shameless plug. But I talked with him a lot about this, and so the way he trains for this specifically, like he said, when he fought Johnny Hendricks, he found a powerful southpaw puncher about the same size as Hendricks, and had him just line up a left hand over and over and over again. Over and over again, thousands of times, he had him throw this left hand at him. And so Thompson could play with his responses to that. He could understand the space. He could understand the explosiveness. He could understand what his options were going to be in terms of responding to that. And he could drill them over and over and over again. So what I'm sure he's done here, and he actually told me that he was doing this, is he found somebody about Woodley's size, not as good an athlete, obviously, but as close as he can find, to throw exactly that kind of right hand at him over and over and over again so he could play with his possible responses. And when you have the kinds of decades of experience that Thompson does, you're working with a massive array of possible options. And, you kind of whittle it down to what you think the best 10 or 12 are going to be. And then that's what Woodley is going to have to deal with.
Yeah.
10 or 12 or 15 different possible responses to a kind of a lead right hand.
Yeah. I think we've basically already spoiled the fact that we're favoring Wonderboy here. So I'm going to make a different kind of prediction. I'm going to say that I think this fight's going to be dull. And I think that because, I think Stephen Thompson probably knows that if he tries to do the kinds of things he did to Johnny Hendricks and Robert Whittaker, he may be in a difficult position. If he allows that distance to close, then Woodley is so fast and so minimalist that he may have a hard time picking up the counters, more so than usual. That's like the opposite of the problem Conor McGregor has with his gas tank, where the guy gives you so little to work with, it's really hard to get your reads down. That's a problem. And it was a problem for Robbie Lawler, who allowed that distance to close and who was, I think, expecting to counter Tyron Woodley. And he got knocked out because his defensive guess was wrong. Woodley can set you up from that range and not give you a lot to work with until he wants you to work with it. So he has that going for him. So that makes the possibility basically very strong that Wonderboy's not going to give that range to Woodley, not going to give him the opportunity to make him guess, and so we're going to have something like the McDonald fight where he keeps him at long range. And then the thing with Woodley is that he's not Johnny Hendricks. If he's kept at that distance, I don't think he's going to go crazy and constantly rush in over and over, which again means fewer things for Wonderboy to work with, but also just fewer engagements overall. So I think the real likelihood here is that Wonderboy keeps Woodley at range for 5 rounds and not a lot really happens. I think that's very likely.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most likely scenarios here. But because Woodley is patient in a way that Johnny Hendricks is not. Right? Like Hendricks wants to be on some level pressing the action. Hendricks is a guy who really needs to feel like he has the initiative, Yeah. And so the question is, if Woodley cedes the initiative to Thompson as we get into the second, third, fourth rounds, which he will, what kind of confidence is Thompson going to have to be able to play with that initiative? Is he going to really try and light him up? Really try and get after him and beat the crap out of him, or is he going to try and sit back and be content to win rounds? I could see it going either way, because this was one of my great epiphanies about watching Stephen Thompson film leading up to this fight in a way that I don't think I'd realized beforehand. And I think it's part of the reason why, as a guy with his style, he's had as much success as he has. He's got a bit of a dog in him, man. Yeah. He's got a fighter in there. Like, he is not some finesse dude who just wants to go out there and score points. Like, Stephen Thompson likes to fucking fight. He exchanged with Rory McDonald in ways that he did not need to win that fight. Yeah. He could have continued to stick him on the outside and just fucked around and sidekicked him and kind of scored points with little blitzing combinations. He let that fight into the pocket, I think, because he wanted to beat up Rory McDonald. You know?
Maybe. But again, Rory also pressured more than I expect Woodley to. As the fight went on, he kind of had to. And I don't know that Woodley will ever come to the conclusion that he has to pressure. I think he's maybe the kind of fighter who always thinks, like, if I can set up the right hand, I can win this fight, and he's going to bank on that and just gamble on right hand every, minute and a half for the final 3 rounds of the fight.
Yeah, that's a really fair point. And because Woodley is going to be concerned about conserving his gas tank in a way that Rory McDonald was not.
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
that's, I think that we're going to see Woodley come to a point where he starts to think like, okay, I can afford to do this much in this round, and that's going to be about it.
Yeah.
So I still think that at some point Woodley is going to try and come in and he's going to get clipped with something big. That's my sense. But otherwise, I could really see it being a kind of a slow-paced, churning thing where Thompson lands like 110 strikes and Woodley lands 40, and it's just a clear 49-46 decision.
Yeah, and unfortunately, Woodley won't be as worried about his nose as McDonald was, so we won't get to see any of that interesting cross-armed guard either. But I feel, both of us, I think, have a lot of respect for Tyron Woodley. I think he's a very intelligent guy. I think he's pretty well spoken. He's obviously doing very well for himself in like entrepreneurial enterprises aside from combat sports, and I think he's a good fighter and very underrated. It does kind of annoy me that people seem to have this grudge for him, that people are so eager to see him lose. But unfortunately, like as you said at the top of this discussion, I just think it's a nightmare matchup for him. I don't see an easy path to victory for the chosen one.
Yeah, I mean, like you put Tyron Woodley in there with Damian Maia, and I think that is a fight that Tyron Woodley wins. I think it would be close, but I think that Woodley finds a way to win that fight. I think you put Tyron Woodley in there with Robbie Lawler again, and I think Woodley probably can find a way to knock him out again. I think you put him in there with Carlos Condit. I think he beats Carlos Condit.
Yeah.
Like there are a lot of good matchups for him in this division. This is just not one of them because like if Thompson were like a lower output kind of striker, if he were more of a Machida style karate guy, I think this would be a better matchup for Tyron Woodley. I think it would look a lot like kind of Dan Henderson versus Lyoto Machida did, which was a very close kind of a nip and tuck fight. Mm-hmm. The baseline problem for Woodley in this matchup is that Thompson has all of that kickboxing background. And he and I talked about this when we chatted, like Thompson doesn't go out there looking to create that one big collision the way that a pure karate guy does. He wants to win rounds. He's going to score points. He's going to land the shots that he wants to land. It's clear.
He has like the 80s kickboxer style where he took the kicks and the stances and the long pants of traditional forms of karate and the tactics and the hands from boxing and combined them. He is a karate guy who looks like a boxer in the way he fights. He looks like he thinks like a boxer.
He does. He thinks in terms of scoring and winning rounds and doing what he needs to do. And if the finish comes, if he can create that big collision, that's awesome. He is happy to do that. But like that kind of round winning instinct is a real problem against a guy like Woodley, because one of the things, I mean, we barely talked about this, Woodley's takedown game and his clinch game, like Woodley, like Thompson's distance management just makes it so difficult for you to get into a position where you can do that. And again, that's where that kind of like fighter's instinct comes in. Like Thompson doesn't concede positions in the clinch. Like, it's not like he's one of those dudes, you get your hands on him and he just desperately tries to escape. Like, no, like Thompson will fight you in the clinch, and he's a surprisingly good clinch fighter. Mm-hmm. He's a surprisingly good wrestler too. Like, he does not, he's got that kind of instinct that we talk about where it's like he is always trying to win positions, that kind of competitor's urge. Like, that's a real bad combination here.
Yeah, like Jędrzejczyk has the same thing going for her. And it means that you put her in a really tough fight, she's going to come out on top more times out of 10 than the average fighter because of that dog. And yeah, I think Stephen Thompson has that too. It's just a bad confluence of attributes for Tyron Woodley. So yeah.
So speaking of which, because I don't think we'd mentioned it so far, if you wanted to hear our breakdown of Joanna Jędrzejczyk versus Karolina Kowalkiewicz, that was on last week's show. That came out, what day was that? November 2nd?
Let me see really quick. It came out, yes, November 2nd.
Yeah, so if you want to check that out, join the angry Polish Karolina Kowalkiewicz fans and yelling at us in the comments.
We got plenty of those. We didn't do our research, because if we'd done our research, we would have concluded that obviously Karolina is literally going to tear Joanna's head off in the first 30 seconds.
Correct. What is wrong with us, man?
We're fools. That's what's wrong with us. We are just damn fools. So let's do the foolish thing and try to constrain a discussion of Kelvin Gastelum versus Donald Cerrone to about 5 minutes, because it's about all the time we have left in a reasonable world, though I imagine we may go a bit over. So Gastelum versus Cerrone. Can I say, to start us off here, Pat, I feel like we've had this discussion before. I feel like Kelvin Gastelum is another iteration of the kind of fighter that used to and is supposed to beat Donald Cerrone, and who I'm not sure will. Like, we have a guy who can pressure, who definitely is aggressive and throws volume and starts fast, who is a southpaw, who has a pretty good kicking game, so he knows how to work the body. We have a guy who has who is a wrestler, who has that in his back pocket. We have a guy who has a lot of the traits that Donald Cerrone has historically struggled with, but we said that about Cerrone's last two fights. I picked him over Cote with reservations. Likewise against Oliveira, because both those guys are really natural welterweights, really big, strong fighters. And then I picked Rick Story to beat him, and in basically all cases I was wrong, because he walloped Alex Oliveira, maybe a little bit of trouble with the striking at first, but not a lot. He destroyed Patrick Cote, and then he destroyed Rick Story more impressively. And Rick Story is a fighter at a much better position in his career right now than Patrick Cote is. Rick Story is still, I think, at the top of his game, and he didn't have a single moment of success in that fight that stands out in the memory. He got taken apart. And so if these three fighters, who all have things that we expect to trouble Donald Cerrone in his welterweight career, completely fail to trouble him, is it just time to accept the fact that welterweight cowboy is the best cowboy we've ever seen, and that the same problems maybe don't exist anymore?
I'm going to say no. Right. So I have been banging the Donald Cerrone is actually a much better fighter at welterweight drum since we saw him fight Alex Oliveira, since we saw him beat the crap out of Patrick Cote, since we saw him beat the crap out of Rick Story. Like, I've been all in on the Donald Cerrone has fixed some of his problems, and yet I'm picking Kelvin Gastelum. Why?
Tell me
because athleticism and quality of pressure. That Gastelum is on a whole different level in terms of his athletic ability, his skill as a pressure fighter, his instincts and aggression to come forward. Like, Oliveira is not a pressure fighter. Like, Oliveira was going to fight Donald Cerrone pretty much in the center of the cage. Not that we really got to see how that played out. Cote is not really a pressure fighter. He's not really comfortable with that.
Yeah,
Rick Story
can be, but none of those guys are really defined like dyed-in-the-wool pressure fighters.
Yeah, like Rick Story, I think I would call him a pressure fighter, but he's not that. But he's not that athletic.
And he didn't pressure Cerrone.
Yeah, he kind of let him. I think we were all puzzled by that when we saw that fight play out. Gastelum is coached by Rafael Cordeiro, who coached Rafael dos Anjos to 2 impressive victories over Donald Cerrone. Gastelum is a natural pressure fighter. He's a much better athlete than any of those guys, except maybe Oliveira. He is equipped to play the kind of game that Rafael dos Anjos did, but as an actual welterweight. So until I can see, I mean, maybe it's unfair to Donald Cerrone because maybe he has shown us everything he was supposed to show us, but like, until I can see Cerrone beat an athletic welterweight pressure fighter, I guess I'm just not going to believe it. And so that's why I'm picking Gastelum. I think, and Cerrone talked about this. He's like, well, I know he's coached by the same guy that coached Rafael dos Anjos. I'd imagine the game plan is going to be the same. Whatever. I don't care. Like, I mean, I feel like we know exactly how this is going to play out. We just don't quite know whether Cerrone is going to be able to deal with it or not. Until I see him actually deal with it, I'm going to pick against him.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally see the logic in that. But I keep expecting, I think part of the reason that we haven't seen anybody successfully pressure Cerrone the way we kind of expect a lot of them to at least try to do is because of the improvements he's made to his game. I think his increased reliance on reactive takedowns makes it a lot riskier to rush in on him. And Gastelum's takedown defense isn't that good. He's a good scrambler and obviously he has good wrestlers, jiu-jitsu, but his takedown game is a little underdeveloped still, I think. Or at least he kind of has to flip that switch from striking to wrestling for it to take over. So I think Cerrone, with his excellent timing with those takedowns and his surprisingly good technique, can probably get him down if he wants to. And even if he doesn't do much on the ground with Gastelum, though I think Cerrone might have a little more skill there in sort of a protracted submission grappling battle, even if he can't keep him there, that forces Gastelum to think. As I think it did for Cerrone's last 2 opponents. It made them think when he started taking them down, and that allowed him to kind of let his striking game flourish. And then you and I have both been very vocal about how much better his boxing has been since basically moving to welterweight, but it's been making small improvements pretty noticeably, I think, since around the time that Brandon Gibson took over head striking coach duties over there at Jackson Winklejohn Gym. And, and I'm talking boxing not just as it means like throwing punches, but footwork and defense and distance management and combination punching and setups. All of these things have gotten a lot better for Donald Cerrone, to the point where he is now attacking with these layered combinations that are just like video game beautiful. So yeah, I'm gonna take. I totally see your side of this pick. I'm gonna take the opposite tack and say that until I see one of the guys I kind of traditionally expect to beat Donald Cerrone actually beat him, I'm gonna assume that he's gonna keep beating them. I think it's like James Vick. James Vick over, who did he fight that I think you've been really high on a certain guy that he fought.
Oh, and I turned out to be very, very wrong about that. I don't think we need to. We need to revisit this.
I'm not here to beat to beat you up about it. But that was the logic of my pick. It was Glyco Franca. The logic of my pick of James Vick over him was not that like I don't see how Glyco Franca can win. It's that James Vick keeps beating dudes in this class, and I got to see one of them beat him before I won't pick him against one of these undefeated prospects. That's how I feel about Cerrone. Until I see one of these like southpaw welterweight pressure fighters actually do what I expect them to do based on his history as a fighter, I'm going to assume that he's going to keep finding ways to negate it. So, and I don't think Gastelum has really quite come into his own as a Cordero fighter just yet. I think it seems like a really good fit given his style, but he has run into some hiccups, especially the Neil Magny fight. He had a lot of troubles with the build of Neil Magny. Now, Cerrone's nowhere near the size of Magny, but he will be taller and a little longer. So we may see some of that crop up again, especially if Cerrone is better at maintaining distance than Magny, and at this point I think he may be. So...
yeah. Oh, he's much better than Neil Magny in that sense. Yeah. Like, this is by far the toughest matchup of Gastelum's career. And it would not at all be surprising to me to see a lot of the different problems that you raised rear their heads. Especially, I think I would be most concerned about his takedown defense and about Cerrone's ability to hit kind of especially reactive takedowns as Gastelum comes forward. But this is now Gastelum's third fight with Cordero. Right, because the first one was the Magny fight. The second one was Johnny Hendricks. This is now his third full camp there. He is not just coming in for camps. He actually lives in Southern California now, so he's there all the time. I just think that now is the time. I think we should expect to see a big jump from him and more comfort with that kind of aggressive pressure game. If there's ever a time to get more comfortable with an aggressive pressure game, it's when you're facing Donald Cerrone. So. For me, I've always been high on Gastelum. I've always thought that that he has this fighter in him, and I think we're just going to see him kind of drown Cerrone in pressure and volume.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's the last one we have to talk about. Really excited about this card. I am currently seeing that apparently Evans Kennedy is off the card.
Yeah, apparently Evans had some sort of medical issue.
All right. Well, that's happening. Otherwise, honestly, not one of the fights I was most excited about. Was a little sad about it, actually, because I really like Rashad Evans, and I don't want to see him going down the drain the way he kind of is. So rather than that, we get to watch a card with no depressing moments on it, because even Jim Miller and Thiago Alves, it should be more inspiring than I think Evans was going to be as a middleweight. And aside from that, it's just great fights up and down. Alvarez, McGregor, Woodley, Thompson, Jędrzejczyk, Kowalkiewicz, Weidman, Romero, Gastelum, Cerrone, Tate, Pennington. I don't know that there has ever been an objectively better main card in the UFC. In fact, I'm going to confidently say that there has not.
Yeah, there has not. This is amazing.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. And I hope you guys listening enjoyed our discussion. Now, I'm sure both of us have a lot of things coming out this week related to UFC 205 aside from the podcast. So, Pat, want to give the quick rundown of articles you have coming out this week. I know you teased a lot of it last week.
Well, it won't be quick, but here's what I got. On Monday, I had my complete breakdown of Joanna Jędrzejczyk versus Karolina Kowalkiewicz come out. Today, Tuesday, I had my complete breakdown of Stephen Thompson versus Tyron Woodley. Now, tomorrow, I will have an interview that I did with Joanna Jędrzejczyk. That will be coming out. Not an awesome interview, but I got some insight into her move to American Top Team and kind of how she approaches things. So that'll be out. Also, is tomorrow my complete guide? or no, my full breakdown for Bleacher Report of Conor McGregor versus Eddie Alvarez. Then Thursday, I have my complete guide to UFC 205, my full breakdown of every fight on the card. My Q&A that I did with Stephen Thompson, I got a lot of insight into how he thinks about his game. Really, really sharp dude. Really, really interesting. And then I will have my Washington Post piece, a breakdown of McGregor Alvarez, complete with lots and lots of gifts. So how many pieces is that? I have 7 pieces this week.
Approximately 300, I think you just rattled off. Yeah. You're a
It was
goddamn
a lot
workhorse. Well, just 4 pieces for me this week, so that's an embarrassment from my side. But I've got a Sherdog preview, full preview of all the fights on this card coming out on Sherdog.com. 2 articles for Bloody Elbow. One basically game planning how Eddie Alvarez can beat Conor McGregor, and the other game planning how Conor McGregor can beat Eddie Alvarez. I always enjoy. I think those might be my favorite kinds of pieces to write. I enjoy like kind of getting into the head of a fighter and also getting into the really technical nitty gritty of how strategy works at the tactical level. And then some kind of video. I think I'm probably going to talk about Conor McGregor being the center of the largest storm of opinions MMA has ever known. Like the most you must have an opinion on this fighter or you don't know MMA kind of fighter we've ever had. So that's coming out as well. Maybe a different topic. Who knows? The videos are always kind of just me just going off the cuff and whatever I want to talk about. But people seem to like them. So that's the show. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Thank you. Make sure to check out all of our articles. And most of all, make sure to enjoy the fights. If you want to ask us any other questions or get at us or talk to us or follow us as we are tweeting during the event this weekend, then you can do that on Twitter. I'm at BoxingBush. That's BUSCH. You can find Pat at Patrick_Wyman. WYMAN. I don't think I've ever spelled your last name for the people, Pat.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Also, one more thing. I'm doing the live blog for the Washington Post on Saturday night.
You son of a bitch. So before Pat can squeak in any more plugs, we're going to wrap up. If you all came here today for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place.
This has rum next week.
This has been Heavy Hands.